Sometimes the most powerful changes arrive without noise. No warning signs, no dramatic signals. What if the moment before your life transforms is not loud at all, but strangely quiet? What if the stillness you are feeling right now is not a sign of delay, but the doorway to a different version of you? There is a phase where urgency fades, where the things that once pulled at your emotions suddenly feel lighter, almost distant. The future stops tugging at your attention, and the past loosens its grip on your heart. This calm can feel confusing because the mind has learned to measure growth through tension. When tension disappears, it assumes nothing is happening. But this quiet is not emptiness. It is a gathering of coherence. Like the moment before a deep breath completes itself, the system pauses to find its natural rhythm again. Life is not adding more pressure in this phase. It is removing the static that once distorted your signal. When inner noise softens, something subtle begins to realign. Your nervous system releases its habit of clenching around old patterns. The urgency that once pushed you to chase, fix, or prove starts to dissolve. Not because you are giving up, but because effort rooted in fear no longer feels necessary. A different kind of movement is being prepared, one that does not rely on force. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They look at the absence of struggle and assume they are losing momentum. They interpret calm as complacency, neutrality as lack of direction. So they search for problems to solve just to feel the familiar rush of purpose again. In doing so, they pull themselves back into the identity that was quietly loosening its grip. From a deeper perspective, this calm is not passive. It is a state of internal alignment. When your inner world becomes less fragmented, life can reorganize around you with less friction. Paradoxically, clarity emerges when you stop trying to broadcast urgency to the world. Presence becomes the signal. Your mind may feel uneasy here because it cannot control outcomes from this space. It is used to steering through pressure, not through openness. Yet observation without interference allows new structures to form. When you stop assigning emotional weight to every possible future, reality begins to move with less resistance. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped fighting the unfolding. If you feel suspended between who you were and who you are becoming, this is not stagnation. It is an unstable pause that precedes reconfiguration, a space where the old patterns lose their emotional gravity, but the new ones have not fully revealed themselves. This waiting does not carry impatience. This stillness does not carry fear. If you are here now in this quiet neutrality, you are not falling behind. You are not losing direction. You are not becoming less driven. You are standing at the threshold where identity begins to soften. And when identity softens, the field finds new ways to move through you. The discomfort of this phase comes from losing familiar anchors. For a long time, your sense of self was built on reaction, effort, and emotional engagement. You knew who you were because you knew what you were chasing or resisting. Now, as those anchors loosen, the mind feels ungrounded. But what feels like loss is actually the opening of space for a different way of being to take shape. When the inner pull begins to weaken, the mind does not feel relief. It feels unsettled. Identity prefers what is familiar, even when familiarity no longer reflects who you are becoming. So as the old drive loosens, the psyche searches for something solid to hold on to. You may notice that old stories no longer stir the same emotional response. Situations that once defined your sense of purpose lose their urgency. Conversations repeat themselves, as if life is echoing an outdated script. Ambitions that once felt meaningful start to feel strangely hollow. Not because they were wrong, but because they were written for a version of you that no longer lives by the same inner logic. Instead of clarity, what often arrives first is neutrality, a soft emotional flattening that feels unfamiliar enough to question. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is the nervous system unlearning its dependency on old reward and threat cycles. Energy withdraws from habits that no longer nourish growth, and that withdrawal can feel like loss when it is actually redistribution. On a deeper level, this is the quiet phase of inner indifference. Not indifference toward life, but toward the old need to control outcomes. The emotional charge behind wanting begins to fade. The urge to shape every result with effort loses its urgency. The former identity loosens, not through crisis, but through irrelevance. This is where many people become uncomfortable. They mistake the absence of desire for the absence of direction. They interpret calm as stagnation. They assume something has gone wrong because the pressure that once fueled their movement has disappeared. So they rush to replace what is dissolving with new goals, new struggles, new reasons to feel driven. Yet the system you are part of does not reorganize through force. It reorganizes when your inner state becomes stable enough to support a different configuration. In human terms, this stability appears when who you are is no longer tied to what happens next. When your sense of wholeness does not depend on a specific outcome. That is when flexibility emerges. As long as you emotionally rely on results to feel complete, the field reads contraction, and contraction leads to repetition, not renewal. When identity relaxes its grip, the signal changes. What was once interpreted as urgency becomes coherence. Readiness begins to replace need. This readiness carries a quiet resolution, a sense that even without immediate answers, you are not fragmented. Even without visible movement, you are not falling behind. The emotional threads binding you to old patterns begin to loosen, not through struggle, but through fading relevance. The past loses some of its weight, and the future loses some of its pull. What you may feel now is not drifting, it is grounding. A return to a state where the body recognizes safety. In this state, the mind becomes more receptive to forming new patterns without interference from stress. The calm you are tempted to distrust is the very condition that allows something new to take shape. Here is the paradox most people miss. The moment you stop gripping your life emotionally is the moment it becomes adaptable. The moment you stop defining yourself by outcomes is the moment identity becomes fluid. And fluidity is what allows a system to change its form without breaking. Not because you are trying harder, but because you are no longer resisting what is dissolving. If this phase feels unfamiliar, it is because you have not lived here before. You have not known yourself without the old identity tugging at your sense of direction. The absence of that pull can feel disorienting at first, but without that pressure, you are no longer confined to repeating what once made sense. You are between versions of yourself, and in that space, new configurations become possible. From a wider perspective, the field grows quieter right before it moves. Not inactive, but recalibrating. Signals narrow as fragmented inputs fall away. What remains is a more coherent direction gathering beneath the surface. The mind interprets the lack of feedback as delay, but the system is consolidating what is ready to emerge. Silence only arrives when interference fades. As long as you are emotionally scanning your life for signs of movement, you are still pressing against the unfolding. This subtle pressing bends possibility back into what is familiar. Not because the field resists you, but because your attention is still leaning forward. When the leaning softens, space opens. Many people unknowingly disrupt this phase. They begin checking reality for confirmation. They measure progress through visible response. When nothing answers back, they assume rejection. Yet presence is not surveillance, and awareness is not control. True observation carries no demand. It does not hover over outcomes, waiting for proof. Expectation, even when quiet, introduces tension into the system. Tension compresses possibility too early into old shapes. The field responds when you release the need to witness change immediately. Internally, this shift mirrors a neurological rebalancing. When emotional anticipation settles, the mind loosens its grip on predicting what comes next. Deeper integrative processes gain room to synchronize. Perception becomes less anchored to what has already been. This is why your sense of time may feel altered here. Days pass without strong emotional punctuation. Weeks feel light, almost unmarked. You are not restless, but you are not entertained either. The usual inner commentary softens, leaving more open space between thoughts. This openness can feel unfamiliar to a mind trained to narrate constantly. Disorientation in this phase is not confusion. It is the shedding of an outdated internal map. The landscape of your inner world is changing faster than your concepts can track. What feels like uncertainty is simply the absence of old coordinates. New orientation has not yet stabilized, Spiritually, this is the unformed space where potential gathers. Not emptiness, but a field without fixed contours. The old structure has lost its emotional charge. The new structure has not yet declared its shape. Nothing is demanding your reaction, and that lack of demand feels strange to a nervous system used to engagement. This is not delay, it is decoupling. A new reality cannot settle while emotional energy remains bound to the previous pattern. When the old story no longer receives your attention, it loses the support that kept it in place. What remains begins to reorganize quietly. Action taken from uncertainty adds turbulence. It fills the space with unnecessary motion. And motion born from restlessness reintroduces noise. The most aligned response here is restraint, not withdrawal from life, but the capacity to remain present without grasping. Few people stay in this phase long enough to let it complete itself, not because it hurts, but because it exposes habits of dependence. Dependence on stimulation, dependence on struggle, dependence on identities reinforced by constant reaction. If you remain here without rushing, something subtle shifts within you. Your inner reference point changes. You stop orienting around what is missing and begin resting in what is steady. Attention becomes less scattered. Presence deepens without effort. Your signal does not become louder in this phase, it becomes clearer. The field does not respond to intensity, it responds to coherence. When inner fragmentation settles, the system becomes ready to resolve into form. This stillness precedes resolution. Not resolution as an ending, but as a convergence. When ambiguity finally condenses into a new configuration, it does so in a single movement. But before that movement, there is a quiet moment where alignment completes itself beneath the surface. If you are here now, this is not the time to demand answers. It is the time to remain intact within the silence. To allow the quiet to complete its work, you have to trust that stillness is not the absence of progress. It is the alignment that comes before motion. This phase is not a punishment. It is a refinement, a narrowing of what no longer belongs. Nothing external is testing you here. Your own nervous system is. The question is not whether life will change. The question is whether you will return to an old version of yourself simply because the new one has not fully formed yet. This is where inner trajectories begin to separate. When life becomes quiet, the mind seeks reassurance. It looks backward for familiarity. It looks forward for guarantees. When neither responds quickly, it reaches for what it knows. Old habits, familiar reactions, repetitive thought loops, patterns that once felt like home. Not because they are aligned, because they are predictable. The former identity offers certainty, and certainty feels safer than open space. But open space is where transformation occurs. From a deeper perspective, this in-between phase is unstable by design. You are no longer synchronized with the old pattern. You have not yet stabilized within the new one. Instability creates tension, and the system wants to resolve tension as quickly as possible. This is where unconscious retreat happens. Not through obvious self-destruction, but through subtle reversion. The nervous system experiences uncertainty as a threat to continuity. So the impulse to act, to decide, to restart a familiar cycle grows stronger. Not because action is needed, but because the system wants relief. This is the quiet test. Can you remain present without resolution? Can you stay grounded without proof? Can you resist rebuilding an old identity just to feel movement again? The field does not respond to patience as a moral quality. It responds to internal stability as a signal. When you do not rush to fill the silence, you communicate something precise. I do not need the past to feel secure. I do not need the future to feel complete. That inner state is coherence, and coherence is legible to the larger system you are part of. Alignment is not something you perform, it is something you stop interrupting. When you remain here without forcing clarity or chasing signs, something settles inside. The nervous system learns that uncertainty can be held without panic. The inner world becomes less reactive. This calm informs the field that a higher order reorganization can now occur. That is why this phase feels like standing at the edge of something irreversible. Because once this stability forms, the old pattern no longer pulls with the same force. Not because you fought it, but because you no longer resonate with it. Your frequency has shifted beyond its familiar echo. And what no longer matches you gradually loses influence. This is not resistance. This is natural disengagement. To remain anchored in this state, a simple act of clarity can help. Not as ritual, not as affirmation, but as an inner declaration of steadiness. To name your choice is to acknowledge your direction. This is not about belief. It is about consistency of presence. And consistency allows the next phase to arrive without friction. The quiet interval does not last long, which is why it is often overlooked. It is not dramatic enough to be mistaken for collapse. It is not stimulating enough to feel like a breakthrough. It rests between, subtle, and unannounced. And because it does not demand attention, many people only recognize its meaning after it has already passed. This phase is not meant to last. A system in transition seeks resolution. Once inner coherence stabilizes, possibilities condense into form with surprising speed. That is why this interval feels like a passage rather than a place to remain. You are not here to dwell in silence, but to move through it without carrying the old identity along. The human mind, however, has learned to measure meaning through intensity. If something does not feel urgent, it is dismissed as unimportant. If something does not stir emotion, it is labeled empty. So when calm neutrality arrives, it is often misread as nothing happening. And the reflex is to seek stimulation elsewhere. Old habits reappear. Familiar conversations regain their pull. Former desires and fears resurface, not because they are chosen, but because they are recognizable. Recognition creates a sense of safety. The nervous system confuses what is known with what is nourishing. From a neurological view, this is an attempt to restore a familiar baseline. Familiarity does not equal comfort. It equals predictability. Predictability reduces the effort required to orient in the world. Even painful patterns can feel grounding because they provide structure for what comes next. The quiet interval removes that structure. Without awareness, the system rebuilds it from whatever is closest at hand. This is why so many people come close to change without crossing fully into it. They sense detachment. They feel the loosening. But instead of allowing the former identity to dissolve, they revive it out of habit. Emotional engagement returns to the same trajectories they were just released from. And the field which responds to coherence mirrors that restabilization. Not as punishment, but as precision. The system does not evaluate your intentions. It reflects the state you have stabilized within. When neutrality remains steady, the next phase unfolds on its own. When urgency is reintroduced, resolution delays. Not a full reversal, but enough to interrupt completion. This interruption creates the impression that nothing ever changes, even though something did begin to shift. This is the subtle frustration many people carry. They believe they failed. In truth, they stepped out of the passage before it completed its work. This interval is brief because it does not demand effort. It only asks that you do not reconstruct what is already dissolving. This phase asks for restraint, and restraint is challenging for a mind conditioned by stimulation. The instinct is to do something with the quiet, to analyze it, accelerate it, or turn it into a strategy. But the silence is not a tool. It is a passage. What is happening here is not preparation in the usual sense. You are not being asked to acquire new techniques or repair old patterns. You are being asked to refrain from interference while your internal signal recalibrates. To let the emotional residue of previous patterns dissolve fully. To remain steady long enough for the absence of resistance to become readable. This is why those who complete a major shift often describe it as sudden. The visible change appears abrupt, yet the conditions were forming quietly long before anything external moved. The transition begins when the former identity no longer asks to be reinforced. What looks like an instant transformation is the result of prolonged internal settling. If you are still in this phase, understand this clearly. You do not need to make anything happen. You need to avoid undoing what is already reorganizing. The quiet is not requesting action. It is requesting continuity of state. When coherence stabilizes, change does not arrive gradually. It arrives decisively. Reality does not drift into a new form. It reorganizes around the most stable configuration available. And that stability is integration, not effort. By the time the shift completes, it does not feel like achievement. It feels like recognition. There is no dramatic confirmation, no internal announcement, Only the subtle awareness that something irreversible has already settled. You are no longer trying to become someone else. You simply notice that you no longer fit the old contours of your life. This is how transitions lock in, not as events, but as stabilized states of being. The mind expects change to be loud, but the deepest transformations are quiet reorientations. There comes a point where familiar triggers lose their authority. Old fears carry less emotional weight. The future no longer demands to be chased, not because ambition has disappeared, but because alignment has replaced urgency. From this state, reality responds differently. The shift does not occur when you decide to change. It occurs when your inner signal stops contradicting itself, when thought, emotion, and identity begin to move in the same direction. This coherence removes internal friction. And without friction, probability does not resist reorganization. This is why many people touch transformation briefly, then lose it. They encounter coherence for a moment, then return to fragmentation through old reflexes and familiar emotional loops. Not out of sabotage, but because they have not learned how to remain regulated once life begins to respond. The work is not creating the shift. The work is sustaining the state that allowed it. When opportunities open and new trajectories appear, expansion can destabilize an untrained nervous system. The system contracts again, not because the opening was unreal, but because the identity had not stabilized within the new configuration. Continuity is what allows a new state to become permanent, not belief, not technique. Continuity of internal coherence. If you sense that your inner world has begun to reorganize, the essential practice is simple. Do not rush. Do not force. Do not retreat into familiar patterns just because movement has resumed. You do not need heightened motivation. You need stability of presence. This phase does not repeat endlessly. It appears once as a narrow passage. If you move through it without reconstructing the former identity, the next version of your life does not need to be manufactured. It emerges.